Hey folks, welcome to Resolve and Post. My name is Gary, and in this video we're going to talk about all things opacity in Davinci Resolve, specifically for the Fusion page, and I'm also going to cover how you can create your very own Fusion tool to speed up your workflow in Davinci Resolve Fusion. So here we are on the Fusion page. Let me first show you what I have going on over here. So in our media in node, we have a Davinci Resolve logo. Let me just drag this down here so we have a bigger viewer, and of course let's rename our media in node to something more appropriate, logo. Enter. All right, so let's talk opacity. I remember the first time I started using Fusion, I remember there was no direct or obvious way to adjust the opacity of an object. So for example, if I clicked on this media in node and took a look at the inspector, there are no available options to adjust the opacity. And even if we were to open the select tools window by pressing shift spacebar, we can browse through all the available tools in Davinci Resolve Fusion, or even try our luck by typing opacity. You'll see that there is nothing here, at least yet, right? Because later in this video, we're going to be creating our own opacity tool that will eventually appear here in our select tools window. But first, before we get to the fun stuff, what I want to do is first show you the more conventional and common way to adjust opacity, which is by the use of a merge node and by adjusting its blend values. What this means is that we need to merge our logo node with another node. In most cases, it's usually going to be with a background node. So what we want to do is click anywhere here in our node editor, and then we're going to press shift spacebar to open our select tools window, and we're just going to type in background, press enter. Now that we have our background node here, we can drag the output from our logo node to the output of our background node to merge them automatically. Now we do want to do this in this particular order, and that's because we want our logo to connect to the merge node as the foreground, indicated by the green connector, whereas yellow connector indicates the background. So I'm going to drag the merge node into our viewer now. And this is what we have. You notice that the resolution has changed, but we'll go over this in a bit. But basically, in order to adjust the opacity of our logo, we have to select the newly created merge node. And then let's turn our attention to the inspector panel here. And so in order to adjust the opacity, we will just need to adjust the blend values, where dragging the blend value down to 0 will change the opacity to 0%. Vice versa, dragging the blend value to 1 will change opacity to 100%. Now, keep in mind, it's very important that you know that the blend value will adjust the opacity of the object that's connected to the foreground, the green connector, of the merge node, and not the background, the yellow connector, which is why it was especially important for us to make sure that our logo was in the foreground and not the background, okay? Because the blend value will only adjust the opacity of the foreground. All right, and that's pretty much it. That's the conventional and common way to adjust opacity in Fusion. But that's not the most ideal way in some cases. And I'm going to demonstrate this in just a bit. And that means we're going to get a little nerdy and a little technical, so bear with me. So if you're just getting into Fusion, if you're new to Fusion, you probably don't know that the background of a merge node dictates the frame size and resolution of the output of the merge node. So which is why the merge node is currently set to 1920 by 1080 pixels. That's the frame size, or the dimension. If we drag our background node into our viewer, you'll see that our background also has a frame size of 1920 by 1080. So the frame size of the merge node is dictated by the frame size of the background. And then the frame size of the background is actually by default dictated by the timeline resolution, which is your project settings. And you can find your timeline resolution in your project settings here. Click on this cogwheel icon, go to master settings, and then in timeline resolution, you have your timeline resolution settings. Okay. So what if we don't want the output of the merge node to be 1920 by 1080, but instead we wanted the output to be that of our logo, which our logo, the frame size of our logo is 217 by 217. Well, we can simply fix that by selecting our background node, go to the inspector panel, select on the image tab, and then deselect auto resolution. This is basically if you want to change the aspect ratio. And then here we can change the width and the height of our background. So in this case, we're going to use 217 by 217. So the size of our logo. And now if we take a look at the final output of our merge node, right? It is now 217 by 217. Great. And on top of that, if you didn't want the black background color, then you'd have to go back to the background node. But this time in the inspectors panel, go to the color tab and then make sure that you drag all of the color channel and alpha channel down to 0, which will make the background transparent now. All right, so now we're starting to see why this method to adjust the opacity is sometimes not the ideal method, right? Because, well, you have to create the background node, and then you have to drag the output of this to the output of this to create a merge node, and then you have to go back to the background node, go to the images tab, deselect the auto resolution, change the width and the height resolution, and then you have to also go to the color tab, change the color. And that's just a good number of steps there that we could have avoided had we created our own opacity node. So let's get to creating our opacity node. I'm going to delete this real quick. So quick and easy to create an opacity node. Let me just drag this to our viewer. Select your logo node and then press Shift Space Bar on your keyboard. Open the Select Tools window. This time we're going to be bringing in a brightness contrast node. So your logo node should automatically be piped into the brightness and contrast node. I'm going to bring this into our viewer now. And then let's turn our attention to the inspector panel of this brightness contrast node. So here we still don't see any options to change the opacity. And if we were to adjust the gain, lift, gamma, it would do what it says. So how do we adjust the opacity here? Well, first we have to enable the alpha channel by clicking on this letter A. And then now if we are to adjust the gain slider once more, you'll notice that it starts to affect the opacity of the logo. Now, keep in mind, when the gain value is at 0, the opacity is at 0. When the gain value is at 1, the opacity is at 100%. But if we go past 1, and we use, like, let's say 2 or 3, you'll notice that it starts to affect its original colors, and that's not what we want. So just keep that in mind. The range that we're going to be using for this gain slider is just from 0 to 1 and no more. All right, so now since we've already enabled the alpha channel, in order to create our opacity node, all we have to do is right click directly on this brightness and contrast node, go to macro, and then select create macro. This might be a little overwhelming at first, but don't worry, I'm just going to talk about the areas that we'll need to create our opacity node. So first and foremost, the macro name, let's change this. Let's change this to opacity. And then second, under the controls heading, go to gain and then make sure that this is checked. And what this does is it provides you access in the inspector to adjust the values for gain, because the gain value is what we'll need to be adjusting to change its opacity. But instead of using gain, I'm going to change the name to opacity. Now, very important part over here, we have these numbers. The first one is to set your default values. So I'm just going to leave that 1, which means opacity by default will be 100%. For the minimum, I'm going to leave it at 0, which means that opacity will not go lower than 0%. Now over here, for the maximum, as I've demonstrated earlier, if we go over the number 1, we will start affecting its original colors, and that's not what we want. So here, we want to change the maximum value here to 1. So once you've done these 3 steps, which is change the name, check this for gain, and then change the maximum value to 1. We can close this window now, which will prompt you to save your macro. Click yes. And no need to change the directory. It should automatically be saved into your Davinci Resolve Fusion macros folder. I'll leave the name as opacity. Click save. And then, drum roll. All right, we don't need this anymore. If we are to open our select tools window by pressing shift spacebar on our keyboard, if we type in opacity, O-P-A-C, you'll see now that there is an opacity tool, the one that we've just created. Press enter to bring it into our pipeline. And now let's drag this into our viewer. Voila. So opacity, as we've set the default value to 1, well, here it starts at 1. And now if we drag the slider down to 0, you'll see that the opacity of the logo is also being affected. Yay. All right. And so if we were to do a quick fade in, fade out animation as what you would normally see in an intro, outro, or bumper of a video, you know, we would move the playhead to 0, and then we would keyframe our opacity, lower this down to 0 because we want it to fade in, move to frame 10, and then drag the opacity slider back to 1, which means 100% opacity. And then now if we skip over to frame 40, let's keyframe this again. This is where our fade out will begin. And then let's jump another 10 frames forward to frame 50. And then let's bring our opacity down back to 0. So if we were to play this through, voila. Very easy. Okay. All right, so now this opacity node is available in all of our projects, which should also help us speed up our workflow in Fusion. All right, I hope you found this video useful. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe for more of these kinds of videos. And I'll catch you guys on the next one. Bye.